The blistering summer heat of 1878 shimmered across the barren landscape surrounding Tombstone, Arizona. Eli Dust McCrae rode slowly toward his isolated ranch, the weight of another solitary day pressing down on his broad shoulders like the desert sun itself. At 42, he had perfected the art of invisibility, a ghost among men, existing on the fringes of a town that had forgotten his name. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." Thunder, his faithful sorrel stallion, snorted and shook his mane as they approached the weathered barn. Something was wrong. The horse's ears pricked forward, alert to a presence that shouldn't be there. Eli's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip, his gray eyes scanning the shadows cast by the crude wooden structure he called home. "Easy, boy," he murmured, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground. His boots hit the packed earth with barely a whisper, years of survival having taught him to move like smoke across the desert floor. That's when he heard it, a soft whimper barely audible above the desert wind. Eli froze, every muscle in his body coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. In his world, unexpected sounds usually meant trouble, and trouble had a way of finding him even in the middle of nowhere. He drew his weapon, the familiar weight of cold steel offering little comfort as he approached the barn. The massive wooden doors hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. Another sound. Definitely human, definitely young. "Who's there?" His voice cut through the silence like a blade, rough from years of disuse and desert dust. A sharp intake of breath echoed from inside the barn, followed by what sounded like someone trying to make themselves smaller, invisible. Eli pushed the door open wider, allowing a shaft of golden sunlight to pierce the gloom. There, huddled in the far corner like a wounded animal, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her once white dress now stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face streaked with tears and grime. But it was her eyes that stopped Eli cold, wide, terrified, and filled with a desperation that reminded him of his own reflection in darker times. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered, her small voice breaking with each word. "My mother is dying. Help me." Eli slowly holstered his weapon, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. The sight of this broken child stirred something deep within him, something he'd buried alongside too many graves and too many regrets. "Easy there, little one," he said, his voice softer now, though still rough around the edges. "I ain't gonna hurt you. What's your name?" The girl pressed herself further into the corner, clutching the torn hem of her dress like a lifeline. "Sarah," she managed between ragged breaths. "Sarah Whitmore. Sarah." Eli crouched down, making himself less imposing. "That's a pretty name. I'm Eli. How'd you get here, child?" I ran," Sarah stammered, her small body trembling. "Mama told me to run and hide. She said bad men were coming." A chill ran down Eli's spine, despite the oppressive heat. Bad men in Tombstone weren't uncommon, but something about the terror in this child's eyes suggested this was different, personal, targeted. "Where's your mama now, Sarah?" Fresh tears spilled down the girl's cheeks. "She's hurt real bad. There was so much blood and she couldn't get up. She made me promise to find help, but I got lost, and it's been so long." Eli's jaw tightened. He'd spent 8 years avoiding other people's problems, other people's pain. It was safer that way, cleaner. But looking at Sarah, seeing the way she flinched at every shadow, the way her small hands shook, he knew his days of running were over. "How long ago was this, Sarah?" 2 days, maybe 3. I can't remember. I've been hiding, eating berries, drinking from puddles." Her voice grew smaller with each word. Is Mama going to die?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Eli had seen enough death to know that 3 days was a long time for someone badly injured to survive without help. but he couldn't bring himself to extinguish the fragile hope in the child's eyes. "We're gonna find her," he said, the words surprising him as much as they did Sarah. "But first, you need food and water. When's the last time you ate something proper?" Sarah's stomach answered for her, growling loudly in the silence of the barn. Despite everything, a ghost of a smile flickered across her face. "Come on, then." Eli stood slowly, extending his hand. "Let's get you fed, and then you can tell me everything you remember about where you came from." Sarah hesitated, studying his weathered face as if trying to read his intentions. Finally, she reached out with a trembling hand and placed it in his. Her fingers were ice cold despite the heat, and so small they barely filled his palm. As they walked toward his modest cabin, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing a line he'd sworn never to cross again. Getting involved meant caring, and caring meant pain. But the weight of Sarah's tiny hand in his felt like an anchor, pulling him back towards something he'd thought was lost forever, his humanity. "Mr. Eli?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Just Eli, child. What is it? The bad men. They knew Mama's name. They knew things about us, about Papa before he died. Mama said they weren't strangers." Eli stopped walking, a cold realization settling in his gut like a stone. This wasn't random violence or a robbery gone wrong. This was something planned, something personal, and if Sarah was right about the timeline, whoever had hurt her mother might still be looking for loose ends. Looking down at the frightened child beside him, Eli realized he wasn't just rescuing a lost girl. He was walking straight into the kind of trouble that had a way of following a man to his grave. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I need you to think real hard. Did your mama ever mention anyone who might want to hurt your family? Anyone who might have had a grudge against your papa?" The girl's face scrunched in concentration, then suddenly went pale. "There was a name. Mama whispered it before I ran. She said if anything happened, I should never trust anyone connected to that name." "What name, Sarah?" Her voice was barely audible, carried away almost immediately by the desert wind. "Blackwood. She said never trust anyone named Blackwood." The name hit Eli like a physical blow. Marcus Blackwood, a name he'd hoped never to hear again, connected to a past he'd spent 8 years trying to forget. If Blackwood was involved, then Sarah's mother wasn't just in danger. She was already dead, and the child beside him was living on borrowed time. But as he looked down at Sarah's trusting face, Eli made a decision that would change everything. Whatever demons from his past were stirring, whatever price he'd have to pay, he wouldn't let this child become another casualty of Marcus Blackwood's ambition. The hunt was about to begin, and this time, Eli McCrae wasn't running away. The modest interior of Eli's cabin reflected the Spartan existence of a man who'd learned to live with only what he could carry. A single room served as kitchen, bedroom, and parlor, furnished with the bare essentials and nothing more. But as Sarah sat at his rough-hewn table, devouring a bowl of beans and hardtack with the desperation of the truly hungry, the space felt different, less like a hideout and more like a home. Eli watched her eat while cleaning his rifle, the familiar ritual helping to calm his racing thoughts. The name Blackwood had opened a floodgate of memories he'd spent years trying to dam. Marcus Blackwood, cattle baron, political puppet master, and the man responsible for more graves than any one person had a right to fill. "Feeling better?" he asked, as Sarah finally pushed the empty bowl away. She nodded, some color having returned to her pale cheeks. "Thank you, Eli. Mama always said there were good people in the world, even when everything seemed dark. Your mama sounds like a wise woman." Eli set down his rifle and leaned forward. "Sarah, I need you to tell me everything you remember about the day your mama got hurt. Every detail, no matter how small." The girl's hands began to tremble again, but she took a deep breath and nodded. "We were living in a little house outside Benson, about a day's ride from here. Papa had left it to us when he died last winter. Mama said it wasn't much, but it was ours." "What happened to your papa?" "Mining accident, or so they said." Sarah's voice carried a bitterness far too mature for her years. "But Mama never believed it. She said Papa was asking too many questions about things that weren't his business." Eli felt the familiar chill of recognition. Blackwood had a talent for making inconvenient people disappear, often in ways that looked like accidents. What kind of questions? About the mine where he worked. Papa found something that didn't belong. Papers hidden in the office. Mama said he was going to take them to the sheriff, but then... Sarah's voice trailed off. Then he died. She nodded, tears threatening again. Mama kept those papers hidden. She said they were our insurance, whatever that means. But 3 days ago, men came to our house. They knew about the papers, knew Papa had found them. Eli's blood ran cold. How many men? 4. The leader was tall and thin, with a mustache like a rat's whiskers. He talked real polite, but his eyes were mean. He called Mama by her first name, Elizabeth, like they were old friends. What did they want? The papers Papa found. They said if Mama gave them up, they'd leave us alone. But Mama, she got angry. She said those papers were the only thing keeping us alive and she'd die before she'd hand them over. Sarah's voice broke, and Eli reached across the table to cover her small hand with his. What happened next? The mean man nodded to the others, and they hurt her. They kept asking where the papers were hidden, but Mama wouldn't tell them. Then one of them hit her with something heavy, and she fell down and didn't get up. Rage burned in Eli's chest like a brand. He'd seen Blackwood's handiwork before, the casual cruelty, the methodical violence designed to break a person's will, but using it on a woman, in front of her child. How did you get away? Mama whispered for me to run while they were searching the house. She said to find the old mine shaft behind Miller's Ridge and wait for her there. But when I got there, Sarah's voice became very small. She never came. Eli stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the endless desert. Miller's Ridge was a 2-day ride from here, through some of the most unforgiving country in the territory. If Elizabeth Whitmore was still alive, she wouldn't be for much longer without help. Sarah, he said without turning around, these papers your papa found, did your mama ever tell you what was in them? Not exactly, but I heard her talking to herself sometimes when she thought I was asleep. She said Papa found proof that someone was stealing from the mine, selling silver that belonged to the government and keeping the money. The pieces were falling into place like cards in a rigged game. Blackwood had contracts with several government mines in the territory, providing security and transportation for silver shipments. If he was skimming from those shipments and someone had proof, there's something else, Sarah continued. The night before the men came, Mama got a letter. She read it and started crying, then burned it in the fireplace. But I saw part of it before it burned up. What did it say? Something about a meeting in Tombstone. And a name. Judge Morrison. Mama said Papa had written to him before he died, asking for help. Eli's blood turned to ice water. Judge Morrison was Blackwood's man through and through, bought and paid for years ago. If Elizabeth Whitmore had been planning to meet with Morrison, she'd been walking into a trap. Sarah listened to me very carefully. He turned from the window, his face grave. The men who hurt your mama, they're not going to stop looking for those papers, and they're not going to stop looking for you. The girl's eyes widened with fresh terror. But I don't know where the papers are. That doesn't matter to them. You're a witness, and witnesses have a way of disappearing around these parts. Eli moved to his gun cabinet, pulling out a second rifle and a box of ammunition. We're going to find your mama, and we're going to get those papers. But first, we need to make sure you're safe. Where are we going? To see the only person in Tombstone I trust, Doc Holliday. He owes me a favor, and he's got no love for Blackwood or his associates. As Eli gathered supplies for the journey, Sarah watched him with a mixture of hope and fear. Eli, what if Mama's already? Don't think like that. His voice was firm but gentle. Your Mama's a fighter. Had to be, to keep you safe this long. We're going to find her, and we're going to make the men who hurt her pay for what they've done. But even as he spoke the words, Eli knew the odds were against them. Blackwood had money, influence, and an army of hired guns. All Eli had was a scared little girl, a handful of bullets, and a burning need for redemption that had been 8 years in the making. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Sarah tugged on his sleeve. Eli, why are you helping me? You don't even know me. The question stopped him cold. Why was he helping her? He'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, this kind of pain. But looking down at her upturned face, so young, so trusting despite everything she'd endured, he found his answer. Because a long time ago, I made some bad choices. I let fear make me a coward, and good people died because of it. He knelt down to her level, meeting her eyes. I can't change the past, Sarah, but maybe I can make sure you don't pay the price for my mistakes. As they mounted Thunder and rode toward Tombstone, the setting sun painted the desert in shades of blood and gold. Behind them, Eli's cabin grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vastness of the Arizona wilderness. Ahead lay Tombstone, a town built on silver and watered with blood, where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card and the speed of a draw. It was the last place Eli wanted to go, but the only place where he might find the answers that could save Sarah's mother. And somewhere in that maze of saloons, brothels, and back alley deals, Marcus Blackwood was waiting, along with the reckoning that had been 8 years in the coming. The hunt had begun in earnest, and this time there would be no running away. The lights of Tombstone flickered like fallen stars against the purple twilight as Eli and Sarah approached the outskirts of town. The silver boom had transformed the once sleepy settlement into a sprawling maze of hastily constructed buildings, each one promising fortune or damnation in equal measure. The sounds of the night shift drifted across the desert, the clank of mining equipment, the raucous laughter from saloons, and the occasional gunshot that served as punctuation to the town's violent symphony. Sarah pressed closer to Eli as they rode down Allen Street, her small hands gripping his jacket with white-knuckled intensity. The boardwalks teemed with miners, gamblers, prostitutes, and predators, all drawn to Tombstone like moths to a flame that burned as often as it illuminated. "Stay close to me," Eli murmured, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd for familiar faces that might spell trouble. "And whatever happens, don't let go of my hand." They dismounted outside the Grand Hotel, a 3-story monument to excess that served as headquarters for Tombstone's elite. Doc Holliday maintained rooms on the 2nd floor, though he spent most of his time in the saloons below, separating fools from their money at the poker tables. "Mr. McCrae?" a voice called from the shadows beside the hotel. "That really you?" Eli's hand moved instinctively to his gun as a figure stepped into the lamplight. It was Tommy Chen, a young Chinese man who worked as a runner for various business interests in town. His usually cheerful demeanor was replaced by obvious nervousness. "Tommy, what brings you out this late?" "Been watching for you, Mr. McCrae. Word's out that you're back in town and there's folks who ain't too happy about it." Tommy's eyes darted to Sarah, then back to Eli. "Doc Holliday's been asking around, says he needs to see you urgent like." "Where is he?" "Oriental Saloon, back room." "But Mr. McCrae?" Tommy stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Marcus Blackwood's in town, arrived this morning with 6 of his best guns. They've been asking questions about a woman and a little girl." Eli felt Sarah tense beside him. The net was closing faster than he'd anticipated. "Any word on the woman?" "Nothing confirmed, but there's talk of someone being held at the old mine office outside town. Blackwood's got it guarded tight." Tommy glanced around nervously. "You didn't hear that from me." Eli pressed a silver dollar into the young man's hand. "Much obliged, Tommy. You might want to make yourself scarce for a few days." The Oriental Saloon pulsed with activity as they pushed through the batwing doors. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies, while the sounds of clinking glasses and shuffling cards created a constant background hum. Eli kept Sarah close as they navigated through the crowd, ignoring the curious stares their unlikely pairing attracted. The back room was separated from the main saloon by a heavy curtain. Inside, Doc Holliday sat alone at a round table, a bottle of whiskey and a deck of cards his only companions. At 37, consumption had already begun its slow work on the legendary gunfighter, but his pale blue eyes remained sharp as winter ice. "Well, well," Doc drawled, not looking up from his cards. "The ghost of Eli McCrae returns to haunt the living, and he's brought a little angel with him." "Doc," Eli pulled out a chair for Sarah, then sat across from his old friend. "I need your help." Don't we all? Doc finally looked up, his gaze lingering on Sarah's frightened face. Word is you've managed to step in something that smells suspiciously like Marcus Blackwood. That true? Her mother's missing. Blackwood's men took her. Doc's expression hardened. And you think you can just waltz back into town after 8 years and take on the most powerful man in the territory? That's either very brave or very stupid, Eli. Maybe both. Eli leaned forward. But I can't walk away from this one, Doc, not this time. Because of the child? Because it's the right thing to do. Doc studied him for a long moment, then poured 3 glasses of whiskey, pushing one toward Eli and keeping the third for himself. The little lady gets milk, he said with a slight smile toward Sarah. Doc, I need to know everything you can tell me about Blackwood's operation here. What's he really after? Same thing he's always after. Money and power. But lately he's been more careful, more paranoid. Something's got him spooked. Doc took a sip of whiskey. There's been talk of government investigators sniffing around the mining contracts. Seems someone's been asking uncomfortable questions about silver shipments that never made it to their destinations. Sarah looked up at Eli with wide eyes. That's what Papa found, isn't it? Proof that Mr. Blackwood was stealing? Doc's eyebrows rose. Smart girl. Yes, I suspect that's exactly what your Papa found. And if Blackwood's as desperate as he seems, he'll kill anyone who threatens to expose him. Where's he keeping her mother? If Tommy's information is correct, the old Consolidated Mining Office about 5 miles north of town. It's isolated, defensible, and Blackwood owns it through a shell company. Doc leaned back in his chair. But Eli, it's a fortress. 6 armed guards, maybe more. You'd be walking into a suicide mission. Then I'll need a distraction. A slow smile spread across Doc's gaunt features. Now you're talking my language. What did you have in mind? Blackwood's staying at the Grand Hotel, right? What if someone were to start a very public, very loud poker game in the lobby? Something that would draw his attention and most of his men. While you slip out to the mine office. Doc nodded approvingly. It's crazy enough to work. But what about the girl? Eli looked at Sarah, who had been listening to every word with the intense concentration of someone whose life depended on understanding adult conversations. Sarah stays here with you. It's the safest place in town. No! Sarah's voice was sharp with panic. I want to come with you. What if something happens? What if you don't come back? Sarah, listen to me. Eli knelt beside her chair, taking her small hands in his. Your mama is counting on me to be smart about this. If I'm worried about keeping you safe, I can't focus on saving her. Doc Holliday is the best gunfighter in the territory. You'll be safer with him than anywhere else. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she nodded reluctantly. Promise me you'll bring her back. I promise I'll do everything in my power to bring her home safe. Doc stood, straightening his coat. Give me an hour to set up the game and draw Blackwood's attention. Then you'll have your window. As Doc prepared to leave, he paused at the curtain. Eli, there's something else you should know. Judge Morrison arrived in town this afternoon. He's been asking questions about a woman named Elizabeth Whitmore. The name hit Eli like a physical blow. If Morrison was involved, then this went deeper than simple theft. The judge had connections that reached all the way to the territorial capital, maybe even Washington itself. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he's very interested in any documents she might have in her possession. The kind that suggest he's willing to pay handsomely for them, or for proof that they've been destroyed. After Doc left, Eli sat with Sarah in the relative quiet of the back room. The weight of what he was about to attempt pressed down on him like a physical burden. 6 armed men, possibly more, a fortified position, and somewhere in that maze of danger a woman who might already be dead. Eli? Sarah's voice was small in the smoky air. Are you scared? He considered lying, giving her the kind of false reassurance adults usually offered children. Instead, he chose honesty. Yes, Sarah, I'm scared. But sometimes being scared is what keeps you alive long enough to do what needs to be done. Mama always said brave people aren't the ones who aren't afraid. They're the ones who do the right thing even when they are afraid. Eli smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. Your mama's a very wise woman. And if she raised you to think like that, then she's worth saving. As the hour passed and the sounds of Doc's poker game began to filter through the saloon, Eli made his final preparations. He checked his weapons, studied the rough map Doc had drawn of the mine office, and tried to push down the growing certainty that he was about to ride into his own grave. But when he looked at Sarah, saw the hope and trust in her young eyes, he knew he had no choice. Some debts could only be paid in blood, and Marcus Blackwood had been collecting interest for far too long. The time for running was over. Tonight, the ghosts of Eli McCrae's past would finally be put to rest, one way or another. The old, consolidated mining office squatted against the desert landscape like a malignant growth, its weathered wooden walls and corrugated metal roof offering stark testimony to the boom and bust cycle that defined the territory. From his position behind a cluster of barrel cacti, Eli counted the guards Doc had warned him about, 6 men positioned at strategic points around the building, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. The sound of gunfire and shouting from town carried across the desert on the night wind. Doc's poker game had apparently escalated into something more dramatic, just as planned. Even from 5 miles away, Eli could see the orange glow of what looked like a fire in Tombstone's main district. Whatever distraction Doc had created, it was working. 2 of the guards had already mounted horses and ridden toward town. 4 men left. Still impossible odds, but better than 6. Eli checked his weapons one final time, his Colt .45, a Winchester rifle, and the knife he'd carried since his cavalry days. Not much against 4 professional killers, but it would have to be enough. Sarah's mother was somewhere in that building, and every minute he waited was another minute closer to her death. Moving like a shadow across the moonlit desert, Eli approached the building from the blind side, where a small window offered the only break in the wooden wall. The glass had been painted black from the inside, but age and weather had created small gaps where he could peer through. What he saw made his blood run cold. Elizabeth Whitmore sat tied to a chair in the center of a sparsely furnished room, her head hanging forward in unconsciousness. Even in the dim lamplight, Eli could see the dark stains on her dress and the unnatural angle of her left arm. She'd been beaten severely, but she was alive. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths. Standing over her was a man Eli recognized from wanted posters, Jake Morrison, the judge's younger brother and Blackwood's chief enforcer. Jake was known for his skill with both guns and knives, and his complete lack of conscience when it came to extracting information from reluctant subjects. "Come on, lady," Jake was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "Just tell us where you hid the papers, and this can all be over. Your little girl's probably dead in the desert by now anyway. No point in protecting documents that can't help her." Elizabeth's head lifted slightly, and even through her pain, her voice carried defiant strength. "Go to hell!" Jake backhanded her across the face, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. "Wrong answer, but don't worry. We've got all night, and I'm just getting started." Eli had seen enough. Moving to the back of the building, he found what he was looking for. A loading dock where ore carts had once been filled. The wooden platform was elevated about 4 feet off the ground, and the door above it was secured with only a simple latch. The first guard never knew what hit him. Eli's knife found the space between his ribs with surgical precision, and the man dropped without a sound. Eli dragged the body into the shadows and took his position, rifle ready. The second guard came around the corner of the building 2 minutes later, probably wondering where his partner had gone. Eli's rifle butt caught him behind the ear, and he joined his colleague in unconsciousness. 2 down, 2 to go. The front door was too obvious, too well guarded, but the loading dock offered a different approach. Eli climbed onto the platform and carefully lifted the latch, wincing as the old metal creaked in protest. The door opened into a storage room filled with mining equipment and empty ore sacks. Through the thin wall, he could hear Jake Morrison's voice continuing his interrogation, punctuated by Elizabeth's muffled cries of pain. Rage burned in Eli's chest like molten metal, but he forced himself to remain calm. Anger would get them all killed. The storage room door opened into a hallway that ran the length of the building. At the far end, light spilled from the room where Elizabeth was being held. Between Eli and that room stood the third guard, a massive man with arms like tree trunks and a sawed-off shotgun cradled in his hands. Eli drew his Colt and stepped into the hallway. "Hey!" The guard spun around, bringing the shotgun to bear, but Eli's bullet took him in the chest before he could fire. The man staggered backward, crashed into the wall, and slid to the floor, leaving a dark smear on the weathered wood. The gunshot brought Jake Morrison running from the interrogation room, his own weapon drawn. He saw Eli standing in the hallway and smiled, a cold, predatory expression that had been the last thing many men had seen. Well, well, the famous Eli McCrae back from the dead. Marcus said you might show up eventually. Jake's gun was steady in his hand, aimed directly at Eli's chest. "You're too late, you know. The woman's told us everything we need to know." "Funny thing about that," Eli replied, his own weapon trained on Jake's heart. "She's been unconscious for the last 10 minutes. Hard to tell you anything when you're not awake." Jake's smile faltered slightly. "Doesn't matter. We'll find those papers with or without her help, and when we do, both she and that little brat of hers will disappear into the desert. Over my dead body. That's the idea." The two men faced each other across 20 feet of dusty hallway, each waiting for the other to make the first move. In the silence, Eli could hear Elizabeth's labored breathing from the room behind Jake, could smell the metallic scent of blood and fear that permeated the building. "You know," Jake continued, his voice conversational despite the deadly tension, "Marcus always wondered what happened to you after the Prescott job. 8 years of hiding in the desert like a hermit. That's got to eat at a man. Some things are worth hiding from, like the fact that you let your whole unit get slaughtered because you were too yellow to fight." The words hit Eli like physical blows, dredging up memories he'd spent years trying to bury. The ambush at Prescott, his men trusting him to lead them safely through Apache territory. The moment when fear had paralyzed him, when he'd frozen instead of acting, when good soldiers had died because their leader had failed them. "That's right," Jake pressed, seeing the pain in Eli's eyes. "I know all about it. How you ran when the shooting started. How you hid in the rocks while your men were being butchered. How you—" Eli's shot took Jake in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying across the hallway. The enforcer crashed into the doorframe, clutching his wounded arm and cursing. "You're right," Eli said, walking slowly toward the fallen man. "I was a coward at Prescott. I let fear make my decisions, and good men died because of it. But I'm not that man anymore." Jake tried to reach for a hidden knife, but Eli's boot pinned his wrist to the floor. "Where's the fourth guard?" "Go to hell." Eli pressed down harder, and Jake screamed as bones cracked. "Wrong answer. Where is he?" Went to town with the others. Building's empty except for us." Eli studied the man's face, reading the truth in his pain-filled eyes. Satisfied, he stepped back and holstered his weapon. "You're going to live, Jake. But if I ever see you again, if you ever come near that little girl or her mother, I'll finish what I started here tonight." Leaving Jake writhing on the floor, Eli rushed into the interrogation room. Elizabeth Whitmore looked even worse up close. Her face was swollen and bruised, her left arm clearly broken, and blood seeped from numerous cuts and abrasions. But her eyes were alert, and when she saw Eli, they filled with desperate hope. "Sarah," she whispered as he cut her bonds. "Is she?" "She's safe," Eli assured her, catching her as she nearly collapsed. "She's with a friend in town. Brave little girl. She's the one who led me to you." Tears of relief streamed down Elizabeth's battered face. "The papers? They're hidden in Sarah's doll, the one she always carries. I sewed them into the stuffing." Eli's mind raced. Sarah's doll. He'd seen her clutching it when he first found her. But in all the chaos, he hadn't paid attention to where it had gone. "Elizabeth, we need to get you to a doctor." "No," she said with surprising strength. "First we get Sarah, then we finish this." As they made their way out of the building, Elizabeth leaning heavily on Eli's arm, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the desert. The distraction in town was over, and Blackwood's men were returning. "Can you ride?" Eli asked, helping Elizabeth onto Thunder. "I'll have to." They rode hard toward Tombstone, the lights of the town growing larger with each passing minute. Behind them, shouts and gunfire erupted from the mining office as Jake Morrison was discovered, and the alarm was raised. The final confrontation was coming, and this time there would be no running away. Marcus Blackwood had taken his last victim, caused his last tragedy. Tonight, in the streets of Tombstone, 8 years of guilt and regret would finally be put to rest. As they reached the outskirts of town, Elizabeth grabbed Eli's arm. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not giving up on us." Eli looked back at the woman who had endured torture rather than betray her daughter's safety, who had found strength in the darkest of circumstances and felt something shift inside his chest, a weight he'd carried for 8 years, finally beginning to lift. "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding me who I used to be." The hunt was almost over, but the most dangerous prey was still waiting, and Marcus Blackwood had never been more desperate or more deadly. Epilogue. New beginnings. Word count. 450. 3 weeks later, the morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber as Eli McCrae stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching Sarah chase butterflies through the wildflowers that had bloomed after the recent rains. Her laughter carried on the warm breeze, a sound that had become as essential to him as breathing. Elizabeth emerged from the cabin, her left arm still in a sling but her face bright with health and happiness. The papers hidden in Sarah's doll had been more than enough to bring down Marcus Blackwood's entire operation. Judge Morrison was facing federal charges, and Blackwood himself was awaiting trial in the territorial prison. "She's getting stronger every day," Elizabeth said, settling into the chair beside Eli. "Both of you are." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Sarah discover the simple joys of childhood that had been stolen from her during those dark days. Doc Holliday had visited the week before, bringing news that the government was offering a substantial reward for the evidence that had exposed the mining fraud. Enough money to start over, to build something good and lasting. "Have you given any more thought to my proposal?" Elizabeth asked quietly. Eli smiled, remembering their conversation from the night before. Elizabeth had suggested they pool their resources, buy a small ranch closer to town where Sarah could attend school and they could build a life together, not as husband and wife, but as a family bound by shared experience and mutual respect. "I think," Eli said slowly, "that it's time I stopped running from the past and started building a future." Sarah came running up to the porch, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Eli, Mama, come see what I found!" They followed her to a small depression near the creek, where she pointed to a cluster of tiny cacti flowers blooming in impossible shades of pink and yellow. "Aren't they beautiful?" Sarah breathed. "Mama says flowers can grow anywhere if they have enough love and care." Eli knelt beside the little girl who had changed his life, who had shown him that redemption was possible even for a man who had lost his way. "Your mama's right, Sarah. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the most unlikely places." As they walked back toward the cabin together, a former soldier seeking redemption, a widow finding strength, and a little girl discovering that the world could be beautiful again, Eli felt the last of his ghosts finally laid to rest. The lonely cowboy had found his family, and the desert had bloomed with hope. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.